Like many historians, I was very busy over the period of the centenary of the First World War. I spoke to a large number of groups of lay people, schools, colleges, local history societies, WFA branches, and all the rest, about the 1418 war. Now, with the exception of the WFA branches, I was speaking to people who had an interest in the subject, but not very much knowledge. WFA groups, of course, are extremely knowledgeable. Time after time, it struck me that people tended to overestimate military casualties in the First World War. So I'd ask people to estimate the percentage of British soldiers who died. Responses were 30%, 50%, even 70%. And I was faced with blank incredulity when I told them the actual figure was about 12%. And then I would ask them what they thought the most important weapons were. In other words, which ones killed or wounded the most British soldiers. And it was common for them to massively overestimate the significance, statistically speaking, of machine guns and underplay the lethality of artillery fire, which actually caused about 60% of casualties. And what is significant for my talk today, they would overestimate the importance of chemical warfare, of gas, in other words. Officially, only 4.3% of British fatalities were caused by gas. While these figures almost certainly underestimate the number of gas deaths, they were still very small in comparison to those caused by, in particular, high explosive shells. Now, the reasons for these popular misunderstandings lie, I think, at least in part, in the realm of popular memory and cultural history. The former reflects that, in Canadian historian Tim Cook's words, poison gas never lost its ability to inspire dread and apprehension in the soldiers who encountered it. Such wariness was not the panic of the Second Battle of Ypres, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it was still a fear that was based on experience, education, and a healthy respect for this uncontrollable weapon. A soldier of the Machine Gun Corps admitted, "I was terrified of gas, to tell you the truth. I was more frightened with gas than I was with shell fire." Gas appeared to be a uniquely awful weapon. And as Edgar Jones's recent research emphasizes, the psychological impact of chemical weapons as terror weapons, over and above the physical damage that they caused, was really significant. It seems that gas touched upon a deep human concern about the risk of being invaded by a potent and unseen force. Or, as an infantry officer wrote, "If the very air which the soldier breathes is poison, his chance is gone. He is merely a destined victim for the slaughter." Similarly, the exaggerated weight given to gas can, I think, be traced in large part to three cultural icons. Wilfred Owen's poem Dulce Decorum Est has achieved canonical status, not merely as one of, but perhaps the most famous poems to emerge from the First World War, and indeed is one of the best known verses in the English language, not least because of the ubiquity of the war poets in school curricula. One stanza is particularly evocative of the horrors of chemical warfare. "Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning." Well, the other two cultural artifacts are this famous picture of men of the 55th Division blinded by gas in April 1918, and John Singer Sargent's equally renowned painting Gassed, completed in 1990. Both are compelling images of the pity of war, to quote Owen again, and to speak of the sheer horror of chemical warfare. I well remember the photograph being used on a poster in one of the teaching rooms in Sandhurst, back in the 1990s with a caption on the lines of "Don't be like them, be prepared for chemical warfare." Well, between them, the poem, the photograph, and the painting encapsulate the popular view of gas in the First World War and emphasize the helpless victimhood of soldiers on the receiving end of this terrible weapon. Now, as I discuss later, gas had the ability to cause fear, stress, and revulsion across soldiers that was actually disproportionate to its ability to do harm, and that read across into the cultural and popular memory of chemical warfare in the Great War. Well, gas has such a terrible and deserved reputation as a horrible weapon, it's easy to see why it has a disproportionate place in the collective memory of the First World War, at least for the British. For those who know something about chemical warfare are aware that countermeasures, PPE, I guess we'd call them today, can greatly reduce its impact and effect on individuals. Just as gas technology did not stand still, compared the crude use of wind-borne chlorine released from cylinders in 1915 with vesicants such as mustard gas delivered by munitions at the end of the war, neither did anti-gas equipment, which evolved from simple pads over the nose and mouth to quite sophisticated respirators over the same period. Broadly, anti-chemical warfare measures kept pace with developments in gas warfare. This helped to ensure that, as anything more than a cursory glance at the military history of the period shows, that poison gas was not a war-winning weapon. Its first use by the German army during the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915 initially promised much, but the battle ended in stalemate. And after the disappointing result of the Battle of Loos in September 1915, the British Army never again made gas the centerpiece of a major operation. Certainly, gas weapons didn't go away, but it seems that chemical warfare simply became yet another minor horror of war, albeit a fairly major minor horror of war, that the frontline soldier had to deal with as part of his daily routine. Also, the fact that gas was not used on the battlefields of the Second World War, with the exception of the Japanese using it in China, can be seen not only as an example of successful deterrence, but also as a reflection of previous failure. So if the argument goes, if CW had been such a success in the First World War, or to argue slightly more subtly, if the results it had achieved had justified the resources committed to it, surely it would have been used all over again in the even more total and terrible war of 1939 to 45. Well, the result of all this is that some are inclined to downplay the significance of chemical warfare in the Great War. As Sir James Edmonds, the British official historian, wrote in 1947, gas achieved but local success. It made war uncomfortable to no purpose. Well, Edmonds' essentially dismissive view of gas in the First World War has been echoed by more recent writers, such as L.F. Haber, the son of Fritz Haber, the German father, as it were, of chemical warfare in the First World War. The reality was, as a modern historian, Edward M. Spears, has convincingly argued, that gas in 1915-18, if not a war winner, was hardly a failure. Initial hopes in 1915, such as Douglas Haig's view that the use of gas at Loos would prove decisive, were too optimistic and unfounded. But instead, chemical weapons became part of the weapon system developed by all armies, slotting in alongside existing, developing and novel technologies, for example, machine guns, artillery, aircraft and tanks, and played a role on the battlefields of the Western Front that was undoubtedly significant, not least during the climatic year of the war, 1918. This misunderstanding of chemical warfare, the tendency either to overestimate its potency, alternatively to underestimate it, in fact has a bit of a read across to the present day. not least because of the continuing grip of the First World War, or to be more accurate, mythologized version of it, on the British collective memory. Okay, so we need some context for a discussion of chemical warfare in the First World War, first by examining total war, and then the development of tactics and weapons, what today we call the learning processes of armies. Now, total war is a very useful concept, albeit one that is slightly surprisingly quite contested among historians. At its simplest, it implies, among other things, willingness to cast off restraints in pursuit of victory. There on the screen, you can see my working definition of total war: an all-out ruthless conflict which all the resources of the state, human, economic, and technological, are devoted to the war effort. And in those list of criteria of total war, I particularly think we ought to look at mobilization and weapons and targeting. And I'll say something about that in a moment, but it's underpinned by that word in my definition. It involves the use of ruthless methods. So, the Germans' use of poison gas at Ypres in April 1915, it was not technically a breach of the 1899 Haig Declaration, which supposedly banned this sort of thing, but it was widely seen as having gone beyond the norms of war, not least by the British, who added this escalation in the conduct of war to the litany of Hunnish frightfulness in their propaganda. And in spite of their horror at this use of gas, which wasn't entirely hypocritical, the Allies proved willing and able to use gas themselves. I said it's not entirely hypocritical because there was genuine shock and horror at the use of this weapon. It didn't stop them actually returning returning the Germans in their own coin. And one of the best bits of hypocrisy that I found, or rather it's pointed out to me by one of my students a few years ago, was that there was a children's book published in the middle of the First World War aimed at a British audience, which explained that while the Germans used gas which killed soldiers, the British used gas which only put the enemy soldiers to sleep. Well, in reality, British gas was just as devastating as anybody else's, and such usage entailed the devotion of considerable resources to developing industries and infrastructure to make chemical warfare possible. So we've got here two facets of total war: mobilization of economies, indeed societies, with the aim of waging war. And also, of course, we've got the mentality that produced the willingness to use these weapons on a vast scale, and also the investment in industry and infrastructure to make it possible. Put all these things together, and I suggest that chemical warfare is pretty well an archetypical product of total war. Also, to make sense of the role of gas in military operations, we do need to see it in the context of the development of armies and tactics. I think you can make a useful comparison between gas and the tank. Both were weapons introduced when the war was already in progress as a response to the tactical deadlock that had produced trench warfare. Both were initially invested with unrealistic expectations of what they could achieve, being seen as being able to achieve pretty well on their own decisive results. And later, both gas and tanks, having failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that was hoped, both of them were developed as very useful parts of an emerging weapon system. In other words, as part, if you like, of a team effort of weapons. Like musical instruments, they achieved their best results when blended with other weapons in the orchestra of war. This is a short lecture, so I'm going to stick basically to the Germans and the British today. And it's interesting to look at the German and British armies. It's interesting to compare the clumsy and poorly thought through use of gas as a primary weapon in 1915 and the highly sophisticated use of chemical weapons as an important auxiliary, although not a decisive or potentially decisive weapon, in the combined armed teams that both sides had in 1918. Well, let's start with Second Ypres. In brief, on 22nd of April 1915, the German army released about 150,000 kilogram of chlorine gas from 730 cylinders across a 6-kilometer front in the Ypres sector as a precursor to a limited attack. The wind blew gas in the shape of a greenish-yellow cloud towards the Allied lines. This was the first of 6 gas attacks during the battle. The gas caused panic among some French territorials and North African troops. One Canadian officer who was behind the lines and moving up to the front recorded that the French troops were absolutely en route and were coming across country in a very demoralized condition, including men on foot, without arms, singly and in groups, alternately running and walking, and only intent on getting away. At the time, nothing was known regarding gas, and the fugitives were quite unable to explain the cause of their terror. Well, on their flanks, Allied troops stood firm, and German troops proved reluctant to advance into their own gas cloud, so they dug in after an advance of only a few hundred meters. And bizarrely, German High Command had neglected to provide reserves to follow up the initial success. Thus, the opportunity to capitalize on the unrepeatable surprise caused by the first use of gas was thrown away. The Germans achieved a mere tactical success. You can see from the map, the dotted line shows as far as they advanced, when there was a real possibility of a major strategic victory. The seizure of Ypres, the last substantial Belgian city in Allied hands, and a key communications node. Now, the capture of Ypres would have been a major success for the Germans. The battle, of course, then degenerated into attrition. The Allies improvised anti-gas equipment, which of course they rapidly improved upon in the weeks and months to come. The second German gas attack was better prepared, but also failed to achieve decisive success. The resistance of the 1st Canadian Division, at this stage who were little more than raw civilians in uniform, played a crucial role in the Allied defence. The Allies then counterattacked, but in general, the best they could do was fight the Germans to a standstill. At the end of about a month's fighting, the battle fizzled out. The pronounced salient that the Allies had held at the beginning of the battle had been flattened, but this was much less than the Germans might have achieved. It was interesting to examine why the German army failed to make best use of this new weapon. In 1919, Harold Hartley, a British expert on gas warfare, asserted that at Second Ypres, the German army had made almost every possible mistake. They chose a gas against which protection could be obtained with comparative ease. We used it in small quantities on narrow fronts in discharges of long duration and low concentration, thus using the effects in depth. And finally, they failed to exploit the partial advantage they gained. Falkenhayn, the de facto German commander-in-chief, I think failed to understand what gas might achieve and therefore failed to plan to take full advantage. In short, he underestimated the potency of chemical warfare. This time, it seems that so did the British. There was clear evidence in the days leading up to 22nd of April what the Germans were planning to do, but the British authorities failed to act on this information. The British, having neglected the potential of chemical warfare, were shortly to swing to the opposite extreme. Here, a central figure is the ever controversial general, as he was at this stage, Sir Douglas Haig. From the moment he heard about the German gas attack at Ypres on Second Army's front in April 1915, Haig, who of course commanded First Army at this time, was intrigued. As early as the 23rd of April, so the day after the gas attack, he recorded in his diary details of the mechanics of the attack that had been gathered from a German prisoner. Initially, he was skeptical, but Haig gradually became convinced of the utility of gas as an offensive weapon, recognizing the Germans had thrown away a major opportunity on the 22nd of April. Something which reinforced Haig's developing sense that something could be made of gas was the German liquid fire flamethrower attack at Haig on the 30th of July 1915, which caused a British battalion effectively to bolt from the front. Now, this is obviously, this was not a gas attack, but actually it reinforced the idea that the use of a surprise terror weapon could have a disproportionate impact on the morale of an enemy. In other words, the damage that might or might not be done in physical terms was massively multiplied by the psychological impact, the attack on morale. Intelligence was reaching Haig and other British senior commanders at this time, suggesting that German anti-gas equipment and training was deficient. Well, Haig was far from alone in misinterpreting the available evidence. A consulting physician to the BEF reported in May that the enemy have it in their power to take any position they like whenever the wind is favourable. It does seem to be the case that a lot of senior British soldiers bought into the idea of gas as a potentially decisive weapon and thought they'd really been lucky that the Germans had not taken full advantage of the introduction of gas onto the battlefield at Ypres. Well, famously, one of the continual themes of Haig's command on the Western Front is his optimism. Now, my view is that this has been overdone to some point. In some cases, his optimism was actually beneficial, but on other occasions it was not. And I think we are now talking about one of those other occasions. When he was first asked to plan an offensive over the unpromising ground at Loos, an area of coal mines, slag heaps, and pit villages. Initially, he was very pessimistic about it, and actually wrote Sir John French a report basically saying, "I don't think this is a very good idea." But over the summer of 1915, his initial wariness about attacking at Loos was transformed, in part because I think that he did come to believe that gas gave him the ability to win a decisive victory. The special companies of the Royal Engineers, under the command of Charles Fuchs, who I think is a colonel at this stage, though he later rises to become a major general, these are starting to make their presence felt. These special companies, in other words, the chemical warfare units, included some other ranks with a science background who actually were ranked and paid as corporals to give them a sort of elite status. All these things are coming together, and this actually is all adding to Haig's optimism. The state of chemical warfare in September 1915, when Loos is actually launched, has not advanced very much since April, at least not in terms of the weapons that are available on the battlefield. Just like the Germans at Ypres a few months earlier, at Loos, the British used chlorine released from cylinders. The problem was with this particular weapon was that so much hinged on the wind blowing in the right direction. And of course, you simply could not conjure up the wind to blow where you wanted it to go whenever you wanted it. Famously, in the early hours of the 25th of September 1915, as the clock ticked down to 0 hour, Haig had to make a decision about whether or not to order the release of gas. His ADC, Major Alan Fletcher, lit a cigarette, and then Haig watched the direction in which the cigarette smoke blew. In fact, too much has been made on Haig sort of, relying on the cigarette smoke in order to make a decision. In fact, what he had to do was to decide whether or not the wind was blowing. To decide the extent to which the wind was actually blowing strongly enough in the right direction, whether it actually was favourable. It was clear that conditions were not optimum. He telephoned one of his corps commanders, his protege Hubert Gough, to ask if it was possible to attack without gas. This had in fact been put in as a pre-planned option, a sort of plan B. But Gough came back and he was almost certainly correct that it was too late to get the message through to the troops not to release the gas. So Haig, in effect, was left with no option but to launch a full-scale gas attack, even though the wind was not blowing in the right direction or in the strength that he wanted it. There was a fail-safe mechanism, or there was supposed to be one anyway, that gas officers would use their own initiative and not release the gas if the wind was unfavourable. But this didn't work, as too often they allowed themselves to be browbeaten by overzealous superiors. Thus, famously on 2nd Division sector, in some cases, the gas actually blew back on the advancing troops. There were actually fatalities from British gas among British troops actually were fairly low. In reality, for all sorts of reasons, there was little chance that Loos was ever going to be a decisive victory for the British, and the effective, not exactly failure, but the fact that gas did not perform to the level that Haig and others hoped that it would do, this was a factor in Loos ending at best as a limited success. Arguably, it was a failed as a breakthrough weapon. The first time because it was not taken advantage of, the second time because it was not effective as a weapon. So that means that optimism about gas had gone from being very high actually to something of a hiatus at the end of the year 1915. Well, I haven't got long enough to go into very much detail about chemical weapons, chemical warfare after 1915. But what I will do is to pull up some key points, and perhaps we can have a broader discussion on gas in the latter part of the First World War when we get to the questions. The first point I want to make is that the introduction of gas onto the battlefield marks, if you like, a step change in the increasing totalization of war. Not only in the sense that there was this willingness to use these new weapons to breach previous taboos by introducing chemicals onto the battlefield, but also I think it's a mark of total warfare, as I already referred to, that the development of the industry and infrastructure to make it possible involved very considerable investment by the British and German states, and for that matter, other states as well, such as France. So in Germany, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry and Electrochemistry, under the leadership of Fritz Haber, who was the key figure in persuading the German army to use gas in the first place, this is a case in point. So is the establishment of Porton Down, in Wiltshire as the British equivalent of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And we shouldn't underestimate the commitment of resources to establishments like this, at a time, of course, in which there's lots and lots of demands on a pool of resources which is huge, but it's not bottomless. By the end of the war, Porton covered over 6,000 acres, and nearly 1,000 personnel were involved there. Soldiers, about 500 civilians, and 33 women of Queen Mary's Auxiliary Corps. They were all involved in some way or another in the development of chemical warfare at Porton Down. And at Porton, all sorts of experiments were carried out which informed weapons development, and of course, in the end, had a direct bearing what happened on the Western Front. In terms of the development of chemical warfare, Germany initially had an advantage because of the size of its pre-war industry, which was able to be converted to making gas. During the war, it produced over 68,000 tons of gas, compared with 37,000 in France and 26,000 in Britain. However, there were considerable organizational problems which actually dogged a lot of the organization of German industry. And so this, to some extent, reduced the German lead. The Germans were not as efficient as producing gas as they might have been. But I think it's fair to say that the French and the British lagged behind Germany in developing and producing the key gas of the war, that is mustard gas. It was first used by the Germans in July 1917, but the French only produced it in May 1918, and Britain as late as September 1918. The second point I'd like to make is the importance of the commitment of scientists and engineers backed by resources which enable the technology of gas warfare to evolve pretty rapidly. I've already made the point that the move away from gas released by canisters, gas borne on the wind, hence weather reliant, to methods that were able to deliver chemical munitions without having to worry whether the wind was blowing in the right direction was of critical importance. As early as Loos, the British were using the 4-inch Stokes mortar to fire chemical weapons. And the obvious advantage of this is it is not reliant on the wind. These are quite big and clumsy weapons, but nonetheless they are movable, so they can be brought into position to deliver a chemical bombardment. This was followed by the Livens projector, which is a sort of a long stovepipe thing, fired by using an electrical detonating wire from the rear. And in 1916, in particular, the Livens projector enabled the British to carry out rapid and dense gas bombardments. But the most important delivery system for lethal chemicals was undoubtedly the gas shell, which was pioneered by the French in early 1916. About 85% of gas casualties were caused by gas shells, which says something about the significance of these munitions as opposed to wind-borne gas. By the end of the war, about half of all German shells were for chemical munitions. The figure for the French and the British were 35% and 25% respectively. The Americans about 20%. And gases themselves became more destructive. In March 1916, the Germans started to use the so-called Green Cross shells, which delivered diphosgene. But as I've mentioned, the critical breakthrough was the introduction of mustard gas, the so-called king of the gases, in the summer of 1917 by the Germans. Anti-gas kit also underwent rapid evolutions from simple pads over the nose and mouth via the gas hood to quite sophisticated respirators by the end of the war. The sheer numbers produced were also impressive. Some 14 million phenate hexamine pH helmets were made by the British from late 1915 onwards, and were issued not only to British but also to US, 16 million small box respirators, perhaps the most effective gas mask of the war, were issued not only to British but also US troops by the time the armistice came around. But it's not just anti-gas kit, gas masks, respirators, and all the rest of it that was critical. It was also very important that anti-gas discipline and drills were adhered to. Soldiers could not wear respirators indefinitely. The more they wore them, the less effective they became, and also helped to demoralize soldiers, or at least reduce the morale of soldiers. So the trick was to have your respirator close at hand and put them on at the very last moment when a gas threat arrives. This, of course, means that warning time was absolutely vital, hence the use of gas gongs, which could be anything from banging old shell cases to when a gas attack began. Something became clear to the British quite early on was that this actually wasn't very helpful if there were people in the rear who couldn't actually hear the gas gongs going off. So they introduced strombo horns, which made compressed air things which made a loud noise. Germans went down the path of having electronic signals based on electronic bells and lights down in dugouts, which would warn them that a gas attack was beginning and get them to put their respirators on. For all that, you still had the problem, both sides had the problem of the Mark I soldier who actually could cause havoc sometimes without meaning to. It was common for people to keep stuff that shouldn't have been there in the satchel which contained their respirator, which might cause damage to his gas mask or just stop him getting the gas mask out quickly. Losing seconds could be very dangerous if you're in a gas attack. German 6th Army's gas officer in late 1916 blamed gas casualties, at least in part, on men being surprised in dugouts, to the neglect of gas discipline, and masks not being at hand. And I strongly suspect that this reflected the situation in other armies as well, at least at this stage of the war, so late 1916. Conversely, as Tim Cook has shown for the Canadian Corps in the 100 Days, that intense gas doctrine drilled into the men, actually by the Canadian Gas Service, was successful in limiting the number of gas casualties. Gas discipline, in other words, getting the gas drills right, actually could be really significant. It's also worth bearing in mind, of course, the Canadian Corps was engaging in extensive offensive use of gas during the 100 Days. Well, of course, weapons themselves are not particularly effective if you don't have an efficient use of appropriate tactics, and all armies on the Western Front gave much thought to how you developed the best, most appropriate tactics, means of using these weapons. Ultimately, the importance of gas came down to its effective integration into the broader weapon system. A really significant point, which I don't think people always realize, is that the success or otherwise of gas warfare is not measurable purely by the numbers of casualties that are caused, but by the fact that forcing soldiers to put their respirators on reduces their efficiency. It's just so much more difficult to carry out even the most basic tasks while wearing a gas mask, let alone fight effectively. So firing gas shells at enemy positions at the very least forced the defenders to put on their respirators, thus reducing the efficiency of individual soldiers and increasing stress and fatigue. So it was a very effective counter-battery weapon, difficult and tiring enough, serving an 18-pounder or the German equivalent. If you're not wearing a respirator, if you've got on one of those things on as well, it can be really, really difficult. Gas was also used for other tasks, such as the harassment of rear areas, and also what today we would call area denial. In the bombardment at the beginning of Operation Michael, the German spring offensive on 21st of March 1918, the Flequier salient was neutralized by saturating it with mustard gas, as it was not going to be attacked directly by the German infantry, so it would not hinder an advance. It also made it distinctly unpalatable for the British actually to operate in the salient as well. When the boot was on the other foot, in the later part of the year, British Fourth Army, in one of the first major uses of mustard gas by the British, fired 30,000 mustard gas shells during the assault on the Hindenburg Line in September 1918, as a weapon of harassment and neutralization as much as anything else. Well, the Germans in the First World War had the habit of sowing the wind and then later reaping the whirlwind. This was certainly true in 1915 with gas, and the reaping came in 1918. Fritz Haber was worried that if the Germans introduced mustard gas but then failed to win the war quickly, the Allies, with their greater industrial capacity, would be able to use it themselves, and Germany's situation would become hopeless. And so it proved. Mustard gas was so dangerous because although respirators protected the face, mustard posed a threat to the entire body. Even if you were if you're fully clothed, if you got splashed by mustard gas, it was perfectly capable of burning through your clothes and causing a nasty gas blister on your flesh. The most effective anti-mustard gas measure was to issue troops with specially treated suits, but they were bulky and not widely used. As far as I'm aware, they're only used by a few artillerymen. Areas which were targeted by mustard needed extensive decontamination, often with bleaching powder and chloride of lime. Now, as the war went on, it was 1918 went on, the Germans were increasingly unable to deal with mass decontamination that the Allies' use of mustard gas demanded, which was just the fear that Haber had about introducing mustard gas in the first place. Had the war gone on into 1919, Allied chemical warfare would have been even more devastating, including using mustard gas being dropped from the air, and introduction of new weapons such as the American Lewis sight, which was an arsenical with the vesicant properties of mustard gas, not available on the battlefield before the armistice, would have been a very nasty upgrade of a weapon if it had been used in anger. And indeed, the historian Jeffrey Johnson has argued that the German collapse in November 1918 spared them the horrors that total chemical warfare might have produced in 1919. I must say, while I was researching this lecture, it did strike me that I haven't taken into account the significance of chemical warfare, particularly during the 100 days, to the extent I should have done. And certainly it does look as though it might have been a real game changer in 1919. Well, it's a measure of the horror that chemical warfare aroused that 1925 saw the signature of the Geneva Protocol for the prohibition of the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases and of bacteriological methods of warfare. This was not ratified by the USA, or at least not until 1975, and Britain, France, and the Soviet Union retained the right to use chemical or biological weapons to retaliate if they were attacked by these means. And yet there was a minority view which went against the Geneva Consensus about the horror of chemical weapons and the need to ban them. Basil Liddell Hart, perhaps reflecting that had he survived being gassed on the Somme, Basil Liddell Hart, perhaps reflecting that he had survived being gassed on the Somme, but might not have survived had he been bayoneted or hit by shell fragment, stated that gas was, quote, the least inhumane of modern weapons. Indeed, in the year of Geneva, the scientist JBS Haldane published a book defending chemical warfare, arguing the use of mustard gas in war on the largest possible scale would render it less expensive of life and property, shorter and more dependent on brains than numbers. There was also the persistent fear among states that if their armed forces did not prepare for gas warfare, both defensively and offensively, they would be at a disadvantage in the next war. So the British Army that deployed to France in 1939 took with it a chemical warfare capability, and they had distinct fun and games getting it out again during the evacuation from Dunkirk and other ports. And indeed, the British seriously contemplated using chemical weapons at various times during the Second World War. Not least had the Germans managed to successfully land on beaches in Kent and Sussex, there was a plan that the beaches would have been hit with mustard gas, which would have been a distinct ratcheting up of the ruthlessness with which the war was being conducted. Just a few concluding thoughts. I think the importance of gas warfare in the Great War, in the Great War has both been exaggerated and it's been underplayed. The grip of chemical warfare on the British popular memory of the war undoubtedly magnifies its military importance, while the concentration on its failure to be decisive as a semi-independent weapon in 1915 masks the significance of gas as part of the weapons system which reached maturity in 1918, and indeed, as I've mentioned, in fact, would have been even more powerful had the war gone on into 1919. Finally, gas warfare needs to be placed firmly in the context of total war. The mentalities produced by total war sanctioned the use of gas. The industries and infrastructure which enabled its development and expansion only existed because of mass mobilization of economies and societies. Shortly after the Great War, Victor Lefebvre, who had been closely involved with the British gas effort and later was a high-up official in ICI, wrote that the history of chemical warfare becomes one of continual attempts on both sides to achieve surprise and to counter it by some accurate forecasting protective methods. It is a struggle for the initiative. At the beginning of gas warfare, in April 1915, the German army held the upper hand, but by the armistice, the initiative was firmly in the grasp of the Allies. Thank you very much.
Tremendous. Thanks very much indeed, Gary. That was splendid. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to raise your hands in the usual way as a virtual round of applause to Gary, I can confirm that nigh on 500 hands have shot up there, so that's tremendous. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching this. It's Q&A time, and heck, we've got a lot of questions, so we're not going to get through these tonight, I'll tell you now, but still pile the questions in and we'll just do what we can. Michael, hello. Your question, please, for Gary.
Hi. Hi, Gary. Thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you. My question is regarding Gallipoli.
Mm-hmm.
And although I know that there are countermeasures taken at Gallipoli, coincidentally, the expert who came over in November was called Lesueur. I don't know if that's the same guy, Major Lesueur, Royal Engineers.
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Yeah. So there was a sort of extensive report on countermeasures there. But I wondered if any proposals for retaliatory attacks were sort of conceived by
Yeah, well, the whole question of gas at Gallipoli is a fascinating one because, of course, gas was not in the end used, but the British certainly made preparations for gas. Gary Sheffield, an Israeli historian, has actually written a very interesting article on this. I'd recommend you have a look at that if you're interested. Effectively, what happens is that the British become increasingly worried that the enemy, the Ottomans and the Germans, are going to introduce chemical warfare onto the peninsula, which frankly would add to an already pretty serious list of problems that the British had. And so they are preparing a chemical response. They decide against initiating chemical warfare, partly because they couldn't really see any major advantage in doing so. After all, by the time they think about this seriously, Gallipoli, they're not going to win there. It's really obvious they're not going to win there. There's also a fear that it would undermine their moral authority, particularly among Muslims. And don't forget, Britain has the Indian Empire, which has got many Muslims and various other subject peoples. They thought it would actually undermine their moral authority if they're seen to introduce this weapon to Gallipoli. And so for all sorts of reasons, in the end, it isn't used. It also is alongside the British fear that when they finally connect up Gallipoli with, they fear that they're actually going to have sort of rail and road communications, which will enable heavy artillery to arrive from Germany and come down to the Gallipoli Peninsula. At which point, they're going to basically be able to shell the Brits and the Anzacs off the peninsula. And so this is all sort of wrapped up in this. What do we do? Do we sort of have a retaliatory capability? And the answer in the end is yes, they did. They didn't get to use it, largely because the Ottomans didn't initiate chemical warfare. And of course, by January 1916, they've left the peninsula anyway. But they did contemplate it, but really only as a retaliatory measure.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that, Gary. Thanks for your question, Michael. Sarah Helen Snow.
Hi, thank you again. Very interesting talk, and thank you very much. So my question is, to what extent did either side use gas or gas attack or fear or promoting it as a tool of propaganda? And if either of them did, who was more successful at using it as such?
Well, I think undoubtedly the British, because
the fear of, or the promoting their use of gas.
They were very good at sort of using the German use of gas as a propaganda tool to say these are the Germans being Hunnish again. If you think about it, in 1915, the Germans very rapidly, late 14 into 1915, first of all, they shelled English East Coast cities from the sea. So baby killers of Scarborough and all the rest of it. They shot Nurse Cavell. They sunk Lusitania in May. And before that, in April, they launched gas attacks. Now, the Germans' use of gas attacks was an absolute propaganda gift to the British, who cried crocodile tears about it and, of course, promptly used it themselves. But it's a really powerful propaganda weapon, adding to the narrative that the Germans are simply barbarians who have ignored the norms of international society. And, you know, Brits didn't need telling this, frankly. But it's very, very powerful propaganda in the United States. And so the British actually, you know, play this card, I think, extremely well. To be honest, the Germans are actually hopeless when it comes to propaganda, because basically they keep shooting themselves in the foot. They also, of course, for all sorts of reasons, don't actually have the reach to the neutral United States, which is really the key audience they need to influence. And so the British, you know, after, you know, they overcome the shock, the shock of having their troops gassed, or rub their hands, say, well, thank you very much, that's a wonderful propaganda weapon, and then they make use of it. But of course, there's always this moral ambiguity that, you know, do the British really want to be seen using chemical warfare? Does it play well to the British position as having a moral high ground? No, they don't. But they've always got the excuse the Germans started it and we're simply responding to what they're doing.
Okay, super. Thanks for your question there, sir. David Crouch.
Hi, Gary. Excellent presentation. It's a question around, because gas was less destructive than traditional artillery with its combined use into firearms plants. Do you think it would have been used more extensively had the war gone on into 1919, or do you think that's kind of often over-egged?
Okay, until quite recently, until I started doing research for this paper, actually, I would have been slightly skeptical about the difference that chemicals would have made into 1919. Actually, I am now much less skeptical. The Americans in particular had they were really enthusiastically embraced chemical warfare. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, the Americans actually suffered very badly from gas in 1918. Partly, I think, because of sheer inexperience, they messed a lot of things up on the Western Front because they were learning, and they learned quite quickly. But once they got a hang of it, but also don't forget that had the war gone on into 1919, the Americans would have played a much larger role in the ground offensive. The BEF would have been reduced to, I think, 32 divisions or something like that, basically halved in 1919, simply because Britain had run out of manpower. So the Americans, and the American army was still growing, would have had a much larger role. So therefore, what the Americans thought about chemical warfare would have made a real difference. And the final thing is that they're actually a lot more aggressive with the use of chemical weapons than, for example, the British are. So actually they've got mortars, I think they've got Stokes mortars, and they're much more aggressive at pushing them up into the front lines and advancing. They're less conservative in the use of chemical weapons than the British are. Now, whether this would have actually made much difference, who can tell? I suspect it probably would have done, but certainly the Americans, I think, would have placed considerable emphasis on chemical weapons when they took the lead, as they would have done in 1919 in the offensive on the Western Front against the Germans.
Thanks, Gary.
Great, thanks for your question, David. Okay, who's next? Let me have a look. Robert Eilert. Robert.
Good evening, Gary. Thank you very much for your talk. Enjoyable as always.
Thank you.
How nice it is to see a historian who is properly dressed. My question.
I only ever wear ties when I give WFA lectures these days.
Right. I once saw John Bourne wearing a collar and tie, which was quite an experience. Yeah.
Has been spotted.
Yeah. In the 1970s, I had the pleasure and privilege of taking two old soldiers back to the Flanders and the French battlefields, and one of them told me that he'd once sat on a piece of earth that still contained the remains of mustard gas, and it so affected his posterior and his nether regions that he had fear that he would never be able to enjoy life again. Fortunately, that turned out not to be the case. But I wonder what were the long-term after effects of the use of mustard gas?
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I will, if I may, broaden it out into all types of gas. There's quite a lot of debate about that, because the fundamental argument that gas is a humane weapon, or at least a less inhumane weapon, is that someone who is gassed, if they survive the initial thing, they've probably got a better chance of sort of getting away with it. So I remember back in the 1980s, I went to interview an old soldier who must have been in his 80s, I guess, at the time. To all intents and purposes, looked absolutely fit, and for an old bloke. He went upstairs to get something and came down coughing and wheezing and said, "Oh, sorry, bit of mustard gas." So this guy was a gas casualty who had lived another 60 years afterwards. So yes, he was a casualty. He survived. Had he been hit by a shell splinter, well, who knows? So that's the fundamental argument. I don't entirely buy it, but you can see why people made that argument. There is a certain amount of evidence that is actually at least in some people, it actually limited life. So actually, you might survive the war, but then you died relatively young, because it could actually sort of reduce the body's ability to resist diseases and what have you. Having said that, I've read something quite recently about it, trying to remember exactly what it said. It was on the lines of that there was a study of pension claims by old soldiers, and they tended to blame gas for almost everything. Actually tying down, you were gassed in 1916 and you have these particular symptoms in 1973 is actually quite difficult. So not a terribly satisfactory answer, but I think actually if you are a gas casualty, depending on how severely that you were gassed, and bear in mind that the lethality rate of gas actually was quite low, certainly in comparison to shell fire or machine gun fire. If you survived being gassed, you had a better chance of living and going on and having a post-war life than if you were hit by a shell fragment or something like that. That's the argument about gas warfare being less inhumane than other sorts of warfare. But of course, that's not how people thought of it, because there's something about the very air you're breathing being contaminated, which is utterly awful, which for whatever reason captured people's imaginations far more than machine gun bullets or high explosive. It's illogical, but that's how people thought.
Okay, super. Thanks for that. Thanks for your question. Next up is James Hayday.
Oh, hello there, Gary.
Hi.
Interesting talk. Only a quick question. I think you'd really answered it for me anyway. It's fair to say that we had no capable chemical industry at the very beginning of that war, and because of the gas attacks, we had to literally build up our industry from scratch in order to compete with the German chemical industry.
That's right. Well, the British industry did have an industry of sorts, but it was nothing like the scale of the German one. And it's part of this, the total war effort that, it wasn't simply raising Kitchener's armies and equipping it with uniforms and rifles and stuff. It was also building up industries in certain areas. And of course, by the end of the war, the British industry was much bigger than pre-war. But they were playing catch up throughout the war. And I think I made this point in my talk, but also bear in mind that chemical weapons are competing with lots of other demands, which means that you need facilities, you need factories, you need personnel to work in it. But yeah, you did see a considerable development of the British chemical industry over the First World War.
And what's the legacy of those weapons now? Because I noticed that I went to France a few years ago, and there was areas that were marked off because there were gas that had been buried under the ground still.
Well, that's right. I mean, gas shells, they're still there in the ground, and every now and again one leaks, and it's really unpleasant. Yeah, it's one of the nastier legacies of the First World War, and of course, in more general terms, I guess that the legacy of the First World War use of chemicals was this. In spite of everything I've just said about, people were talking about using it in the interwar period, there was a reluctance to use it on the battlefield in the Second World War, which when you think about it, every other weapon, up to and including nuclear weapons, are used between 39 and 45. But at least in the European theatre, you don't get the use of gas. And that's partly a matter of deliberate and conscious restraint. It's also a matter, I think, of deterrence. Both sides were aware that the other side had chemical weapons capabilities. Both sides knew they had anti-gas capabilities. And there was one of these rational, well, would it advantage me to start using chemical weapons? No, it wouldn't, therefore I won't. The irony is that by later in the war, the Germans had nerve gas, which the British didn't have, or at least not enough to actually make use of, and actually that British anti-gas, certainly civilian anyway, and anti-gas kit would not have held out nerve gas. But it's one of the successful examples of intra-war deterrence. Both sides have this weapon; it cancels each other out. They decide not to use it.
Okay. Well, many thanks for that. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, there, James.
Thank
Kate Thompson.
Yes, thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm minded of one of the songs from Oh What a Lovely War, and they talk about phosgene. Was that used, or is that just something that was dreamt up?
No, phosgene was used. I think I mentioned it during my talk, actually.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's introduced from memory late 1915, early 1916. What you see throughout the war is a continual improvement in gases, and it's a race against time, really. Both sides are developing gases at roughly the same rate. Sometimes they get their nose in front, then the other one does. So chlorine is then succeeded by things like phosgene, but I'd say it's actually mustard gas, mid 1917, which is described as the king of gases. So the soldiers' experience of chemical warfare very much depends on what part of the war they are talking about, both the sort of gas that they would have been up against, and of course the sort of anti-gas kit they would have worn. I mean, there's a big difference between a pad tied over the nose and mouth, a bit like we're wearing today, and a small box respirator, which is the sort of the best bit of anti-gas kit in the First World War, which is in use by the end of the war, is really quite a sophisticated bit of kit. It's an amazingly rapid development of both gas as a weapon and anti-gas equipment from 1915 to 1918.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for your question, Kate. David Williams.
Fascinating presentation. Thanks.
I'll read your question out, David.
Okay, yeah.
David's question just briefly was, why did the British not use gas as part of the opening offensive on the Somme in 1916?
Right. I must say I've forgotten the precise reason for it. No, I can't remember, to be honest. I know there is a good reason why it wasn't used. I was talking about this with somebody recently, and we were trying to work out what would it have made much of a difference had it been used. My answer is probably no, because after all, the fundamental problem of the attack on the Somme on the 1st of July is the artillery doesn't do its job. It doesn't neutralize the enemy artillery. It doesn't cut the wire. In July 1916, certainly British gas warfare techniques are not yet sophisticated enough to do what I've been talking about in the talk. Therefore, saturating enemy gun positions with gas and forced to put their respirators on and all the rest of it. So I suspect if gas had been used, it would have been maybe of marginal help, but actually it wouldn't, I think, have made much difference to the overall result. The gas as a weapon and more broadly, the British weapon system was not yet mature enough to make it work properly. Towards the end of the Somme, maybe you're showing you're getting a few more signs of this maturing, but not, I think, in July 1916.
Okay, thanks very much. I've muted David, so unfortunately I can't respond to that. But thanks for your question there, David. Thanks for your question. Mark.
Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Gary.
Oh, thank you.
I have quite a bit of experience of 36 years in the military, in the Air Force is where I worked, but in the Cold War days of the Soviet threat. So actual things like phosgene, even then we talked of freshly mown grass, if you got the smell of it, and horseradish, you smell of that. These were like the early detection type things. So going back to that lady's question, talking about phosgene, back in the 80s we were still like researching on how to find out the ways of what type of agents are being used on us. But I guess my question back to the First War is, the specialist units then, how did it all create? Because it was quite new gas warfare, wasn't it? How did the British, how did we actually structure it? And like the colour, how do we colour code the shells and things like that?
Oh, well, I'm afraid that's a sort of technical detail I just don't know. My interest really is in gas as a weapon and how it fitted into the bigger picture. I'll say something about the organisation, however, because of course the Special Brigade Royal Engineers, which initially was formed of 4 special companies. This was under, as I say, I think at the time he was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Fawkes, who wrote a rather big book bigging up chemical warfare and bigging up his part in it. Donald Richter, about 30 years ago, wrote a book called Chemical Soldiers, which is actually very good on this sort of stuff. So what you see is an early example of specialists being brought in from different parts of the army to make a sort of highly specialized units. So a call is put out for people with experience of chemistry and a science background. So you do get a surprising number of sort of science graduates are serving as privates in Kitchener's army, and a number of these are actually then seconded to the special companies, and so they therefore are able to put their expertise to good use. Now, of course, this is just the beginning of it, and by the end of the war, the whole specialist forces with gas warfare has expanded quite considerably in the British Army. And you could actually sort of draw parallels with things like trench mortars and tanks, things which start off as being sort of peripheral, but become more and more important as people come to recognise their significance when put into this bigger team effort, the weapon system. And so by the end of the war, you have a considerable number of gas troops and gas officers, and it's become almost part of normal commerce, if I can put it that way, of the battlefield. But I say, if you want sort of specific details of that, I could recommend Donald Richter's book, Chemical Soldiers.
So thanks for that. Thanks for your question there, Mark. Right, Neil Pearce, let me just ask you to unmute yourself there, Neil.
Thank you, Gary. Splendid talk. Just a quick one. Did the Army or the services, did they go, similar question to Mark really, did they go to the fire brigade or the mine rescue services for any advice in breathing apparatus?
I don't know, to be honest. I'm sorry.
Yes,
I haven't looked at that sort of level of detail.
Thanks anyway.
No worries. Neil, thanks for your question. Stuart Adlam. Stuart.
Good evening, Gary.
Hi, Stuart.
Thank you for your interesting presentation. Several times in your lecture, you talked about the effectiveness of both chemical weapons and anti-gas measures. I was wondering, how would you define and quantify effectiveness?
Oh, bite a bit there. Stuart's doing my Wolverhampton MA, and I always put at the beginning of essays, define your terms. Effective is in these terms actually doing the job that that actually it's been set. One of the problems I think about the use of gas at Loos is quite simply the bar was set too high. So if you judge the effectiveness of gas at Loos, it doesn't achieve a breakthrough. Does that mean that gas was completely useless? Well, no, it doesn't, because actually gas did achieve some local success. Edward Spear's argument and his book on chemical warfare, which I've drawn upon from this, is best book I think out at the moment on it. In fact, a new edition is just about to appear. That's very much his argument, that people like Ludwig Haber, so the son of Fritz Haber, who argues that gas warfare was a failure in the First World War, simply setting unrealistic bar over which you need to get to acknowledge a success. In fact, if you look at it in the round, gas is really pretty significant, because if you deduct gas from the weapons system of 1918, then something really quite significant has been taken away. Just imagine that you don't have gas. Therefore, when the BEF is launching its attacks during the 100 days, it's not as effective in suppressing German artillery fire, because you're no longer able to plaster gun batteries with shells. Choke points like sort of railway bridges and crossroads, all of these are really vulnerable to being hit with chemicals, particularly mustard, as I was saying, because whereas something like phosgene, it disperses after a bit. Mustard, you really need to go in there and do decontamination, which is actually quite labour intensive. It actually takes quite a long time. All of this needs to be factored into the success or otherwise of chemical warfare. So I must say, over the years, my attitudes towards chemical warfare have actually changed. I now see it as, it certainly wasn't decisive in its own right. It didn't win the war, but it's more significant than I thought it was a few years ago, because I've read more evidence on a little bit of original research, and I've read the scholarship on the subject. So yeah, it's really about setting the barrier for success at a reasonable level. If you put it too high, yeah, it's a failure. But if you actually say, well, actually, did it actually achieve something? Yes, it did.
Right, thank you, Gary.
Thanks for your question, Stuart. Glenn, if you want to unmute yourself. Glenn, you're live.
Yeah, hi, Gary, one of your former MA students.
Indeed, hi, Glenn.
In anticipation of your gas lecture today and my current work on March 1918, I had a look at the statistics on gas for the first time. And I was very surprised to see a couple of things. The first one, supporting your view on gas as a terror weapon, that of those admitted to hospital who were gassed, only 1% actually died, which absolutely supports your view. I then read the GHQ Gas Services report for March 1918, which of course would have been done by Fuchs, who said that the Bruchmüller's bombardment on the 21st of March was largely ineffective. And looking at the gas casualties at the week ending the 23rd of March, Third Army suffered just over 2,000 and Fifth Army was only 1,200. Now, there's two possibilities for that. One was that the British countermeasures were actually very, very good, or perhaps the myth of Bruchmüller's bombardment as regards gas has been overplayed in the past. Have you got any comments on
well,
that?
There's a third view that actually it was successful, not in the number of people it killed or wounded, but actually forcing them into their respirators, which made everything much more difficult for them to do, and help to lower their morale. I suspect it's a bit of all of that. I should also say that the Germans, of course, in the run up to 21st of March, were launching gas raids. in fact, if I can just plug my most recent book, In Haig's Shadow, the letters of Major General Hugo Dupree and his uncle Douglas Haig. Dupree takes over a command of one of the brigades of the 63rd Royal Naval Division at very short notice, just before the March offensive, because the previous brigadier is caught in a gas attack. He and a lot of his staff are taken out in one go. So it's not all the effect wasn't all just on the day. There was also, if you like, a sort of series of attritional gas releases in the run-up to the offensive, all of which was cumulative. And the final point I guess I'd make is that, well, to reinforce the point you made about the relatively low number of troops who were killed by gas, it was a psychological weapon. And this, for whatever reason, being gassed and survived, it still spooked a lot of people because they had been gassed, if I can put it that way. Chemical weaponry brings about a terror in human beings, which is probably not directly related to its actual lethality, but nonetheless, it's irrational at one level, completely understandable, if that's not too contradictory, at another. You know, the idea of desperately trying to get your gas mask on and all the rest of it and fumbling. I mean, the power of Owen's poem, I think, just brings that home, particularly if you're an idiot who stuffed your small box respirator satchel with your chocolate ration or what have you, and pulling all that stuff out of the way before you can get your gas mask on. So yeah, I take your point, but I think the psychological impact of it, and also the sheer exhaustion of having to do stuff wearing a respirator, I think we should lose sight of.
Okay, thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks, Glenn, for your question. That's great. Right, Gary, it's now 9:30, and I think in the tradition of what I try to aim for in terms of timing, that's the bewitching hour where I'm going to call it a day in terms of questions. Everybody who's put a question up and who we've simply just run out of time. It's just the way it is, that we can get through on these evenings. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd just like to raise your hands as the virtual round of applause once again, and I can confirm, Gary, that the hands are going up like that on the bottom of the screen as the round of applause. Gary, splendid talk, thoroughly enjoyed that. Your internet connection was good. I hope mine is not as bad as it sometimes is. It's just some comes and goes. But I'd like to thank you once again for a splendid talk and giving your time to the association once again.
My absolute pleasure, and thank you for some excellent questions. No, I enjoyed that session. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you enjoyed it, because I certainly did. I know all the members who were on board for this enjoyed it as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, the next webinar is Armistice Day evening at 8 p.m. When we'll be listening about the unknown warrior, well, you can see the details on the website. I'm not going to take up any more time. So on that note, Gary, once again, thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see everybody on Wednesday evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers